So we understand that adverse reactions to vaccines are not due to something in the vaccine, but rather to the response of the immune system. That's been recognized for a long time now. The question is, what is it about the immune response that makes us feel these side effects? The answer is that part of our immune response involves what's called a humoral response. And that word humoral refers to a chemical response. Part of what our immune cells do as they respond to an antigen is release a bunch of chemicals. And these chemicals are important because they help destroy the pathogen and they help trigger an inflammatory response, which will also destroy the pathogen. And they actually signal or recruit other immune cells to come into the area and join the fight. Now, some of the most notorious humoral chemicals are the cytokines, and you may have heard of cytokines. Cytokines are responsible for fever. They're responsible for inflammation like pain at the injection site, redness, swelling. They and other chemicals are also responsible for the muscle aches and the fatigue that we sometimes experience when our immune system is stimulated by a vaccine. It's interesting to note that back in 2009, back when we had a swine flu pandemic, that pandemic was much less severe than the one we're currently in. But back then, the influenza virus that was pandemic around the globe, that was an H1N1 influenza virus. That virus didn't seem to affect the elderly as much as we would normally expect it to. Instead, we saw worse effects in people who were in their late teens and early 20s. Those were the people that were most severely affected by that virus and most often hospitalized. It's interesting because it turns out that the young people were experiencing what's known as a cytokine storm after exposure to that H1N1 influenza. You have to understand, in a healthy, well-nourished, well-rested, otherwise normal, late teen, early 20 person, the immune system is really at its best. And not only did those people have a cytokine release, but they had an over release of cytokines, or what we call a cytokine storm, when they became infected with H1N1. Now, severe allergic reactions, remember that's the anaphylaxis, that sometimes occur with vaccination. That's also due to the immune system. But interestingly enough, it's not due to these humoral chemicals that are released by the immune system. Rather, it's an immune response to something in the vaccine other than the causative agent. Most people who have an anaphylactic response to a vaccine are responding to either the preservative or an adjuvant that might be in the vaccine. Anaphylaxis is almost never related to the causative agent. So I'm sure you've known in recent weeks the stories about people who are very hesitant to receive the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. There are some people who are just nervous about it, particularly about the side effects they may experience after the second dose. But there are also people who are sort of rabidly anti-vaccination in general. These are the people that have concerns about vaccination that are really unwarranted. Anti-vaccination sentiment has been growing in this country over the past few years or even decades. And unfortunately, our internet connections allow for these fears to be disseminated really widely across social media networks. I've got a list on this slide of the things that people say most commonly when they report that they are against vaccinations. Number one concern is that the vaccines can cause the disease that they are intended to prevent. You hear this a lot with regard to the influenza vaccine. You'll hear people say, well, I got the vaccine last year and then I came down with the flu. So I know that it was the vaccine that gave me the flu. In reality, what happened to that person was that they were exposed to the flu before they got the vaccine. Remember, it takes 2 weeks to mount an immune response to a vaccine. It also takes about 2 to 10 days on average to respond to a pathogen and get sick. So that person most likely got exposed to the flu, and while that flu was incubating in their body, they then got the vaccine. And while the vaccine was starting to work, the influenza that they got exposed to made them sick. It's hard for people to understand this because most people don't understand infectious disease, let alone vaccination. But it is a fact that there is no vaccine that can cause the disease that it is intended to prevent. That is a fact. The number 2 reason that people give is that vaccines contain too many antigens. This is especially popular as a complaint among parents who are against vaccination. They will tell you that vaccines like MMR simply contain too many antigens and their poor infant cannot be expected to receive that many antigens all at once. Number 3 is that vaccines can cause autism. Number 4 is that vaccines can cause some other disease other than what the vaccine prevents. And there are other what I'll call bizarre theories about vaccination as well. Let's talk about these. Remember, modern vaccines cannot cause disease. It's not possible. Because the causative agent, even if it's left intact, even if it's whole, it has either been killed or it's been modified, so it can no longer cause disease. The reason that people experience disease shortly after vaccination is because they got exposed to the disease before they were vaccinated. What about this idea of too many antigens? Let's think again about the MMR vaccine that's given to young infants, and it's given several times. This has 3 separate antigens in it: measles, mumps, rubella. The Tdap vaccine I mentioned: tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis. Parents hear that the vaccine is protecting against 3 different pathogens, and they worry that that's too much to give all at once. The belief is that it's somehow overwhelming the immune system and somehow harming their little infant. Listen, the immune system, even in a little infant, is capable of responding to multiple antigens at a time. In fact, infants are routinely exposed to hundreds of antigens every single day. Think about what infants do. They grab things and put them in their mouths. They nurse against their mother's skin. They are taking in antigens all day, every day, and they are priming their immune system. They are doing what nature intended for their immune system. So no, 3 or even 4 or 5 antigens in a vaccine will not overwhelm an infant's immune system. You may or may not be familiar with a study that came out many years ago now that suggested that vaccination was the reason that so many young children were being diagnosed with autism. There was one study that caused this uproar, and it was authored by a person named Dr. Wakefield. Dr. Wakefield performed his experiment on 12 children that were in his own pediatric practice. All of these children had been vaccinated, and a certain number of them had gone on to develop autism. So Dr. Wakefield concluded that the vaccines were causing the autism. I cannot tell you how widely this study was disseminated, and unfortunately, it is the one study that most people who are anti-vaccination will refer to when they talk about the connection between vaccination and autism. Since Dr. Wakefield published that study, it has been pulled from the journals. It has been discredited. It should probably never have been published to begin with. First of all, Dr. Wakefield had way too few test subjects in his study, only 12. All 12 of these kids were in his practice instead of coming from multiple practices. All 12 of them were vaccinated by Dr. Wakefield. He did not have a proper control group. He did not do proper follow-up with these children. The whole study was a mess. And like I said, it's been withdrawn from the literature because of that. There have been no other studies that have conclusively linked autism with vaccination. So the question is, why is it that parents sometimes report that their children get diagnosed with autism soon after receiving vaccinations? The answer is that autism just tends to be diagnosed at the same time that children are routinely vaccinated. In other words, those two things are correlated, but they are not a cause of one another. There have been dozens and dozens of studies done since Dr. Wakefield's study that show that there is no correlation between vaccination and autism. And there has not been a single study that shows that correlation exists. There is simply no link between vaccination and the development of autism. What about the concern that a vaccination can trigger some other disease other than the disease the vaccine is meant to prevent? What about the idea that vaccinations can cause permanent, serious injuries? You may have heard stories on the internet about people who've been vaccinated who have then gone on to develop very unusual neurologic diseases. There was a famous incident several years ago now of a young woman who received an influenza vaccine and claimed that after the vaccination, she could no longer walk normally. In fact, she could only walk backwards. There was video taken of her walking backwards that was posted to YouTube and widely disseminated. It took a while, but this was debunked. It turned out that she had made up her symptoms. But unfortunately, the video had already reached so many people around the world that people became concerned that this was a possible side effect of the influenza vaccine. Remember, most vaccine-associated reactions are mild and very short-lived. The severe long-term injuries that sometimes occur from vaccination are rare. The fever, the seizures, those serious things that are sometimes caused by the immune system, are caused by the immune system, not the vaccine. And finally, any individual that has a problem with their immune system is going to have more risk of an adverse reaction when they are vaccinated. But that does not mean that the vaccine created the injury. The immune system is what produces those effects. I have a short list on this slide of these other bizarre theories that I referenced. One of the ones I think of most often comes from the introduction of the HPV vaccine and the recommendation that all girls receive this vaccine before they became sexually active. Again, the idea is to promote immunity against human papillomavirus before the young girl engages in sexual activity, so that she's protected from exposure to HPV until she's vaccinated. Remember, human papillomavirus is the most common cancer-causing virus that we know of. 90% of cervical cancers in women are due to previous or current infection with HPV. That's remarkable. That means that if we can vaccinate against HPV, we can prevent 90% of cervical cancers. That's the only cancer we can say that for. Unfortunately, when the HPV vaccine was first introduced and parents were told that their 12 and 13-year-old daughters needed to be vaccinated against this sexually transmitted disease, many of them thought that this would somehow tell their daughters that they should engage in sexual activity, that somehow HPV vaccination would make their child sexually promiscuous. I don't even know what to say to that, except that in the years that we've been vaccinating young teenagers against HPV, there has been no evidence of an increase in sexual activity among the vaccinated. There has also been no reports of those rare and severe adverse reactions to the HPV vaccine. It's safe and it's effective. So here's some final thoughts about vaccination I'd like you to take away with you. Vaccination programs have been the single most effective public health program in history. We have prevented more disease, more suffering, and more death through vaccination programs than through any other public health program. The truth is, some people cannot be vaccinated. And that's why we need as many people as possible who are able to be vaccinated to get vaccinated, because that's going to help us achieve herd immunity, and that's going to protect our most vulnerable. The risk of serious, life-threatening, life-altering vaccine reactions is about 1 in a million. There is a much higher risk of contracting and experiencing those life-threatening problems by contracting the disease than by getting the vaccine. Children would be at a much higher risk of injury and death from the diseases that we vaccinate against than they are from the vaccines. Some states only allow medical reasons for a child not getting vaccinated before they go into school. But you should know that in some states, these laws are changing. There are states that are now relenting to pressure and allowing parents to claim a personal exemption against vaccination so they can send their children to public school unvaccinated. This is a terrible idea. This is the reason why diseases like measles are coming back. We never saw measles when I was a child because you had to be vaccinated against it if you wanted to come to public school. I think it's important that we have discussions about the facts of vaccination before we start allowing parents to refuse vaccination for their children and put other people at risk. There are a couple of vaccines that are in development that I'd like us to be familiar with. One of the most horrific epidemics that this country has experienced in recent years was the HIV epidemic. One of the saddest facts about HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus that causes AIDS, one of the saddest facts is that we have been unable to develop a vaccine that is safe and effective in preventing that infection. The good news is that we haven't given up. Work is continuing even today to develop an effective HIV vaccine. Scientists who study HIV will tell you that the problem with this virus in terms of producing a vaccine is that there are literally thousands of variants of this virus. We've been talking about the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 in the media. Well, there are thousands of variants of HIV around the world. The spike protein on the surface of the human immune deficiency virus varies tremendously from variant to variant to variant. And remember, the spike protein, which is the part of the virus that binds to host cells, the spike protein is the most common target of vaccines. So when it comes to the HIV vaccine, scientists know now that we need a vaccine that targets not the spike protein of HIV, but some part of it that stays relatively constant between all of these thousands of strains. They're trying to find a portion of the virus that will elicit a good immune response that doesn't tend to vary from mutant to mutant to mutant. And that's hard work. But we've had some recent good news in that a group of scientists at Scripps Research Foundation have put together an HIV vaccine that's actually gone into phase 1 clinical trials. Now, we don't know if that vaccine is safe and effective yet, but it's exciting that it has at least entered clinical trials because most of the vaccines that have been experimentally developed against HIV have not made it that far. One thing that scientists agree on is that any HIV vaccine that does eventually get made will most likely require multiple boosters across the life of the vaccinated person. Down here on the bottom of the slide, there's an artist's drawing of HIV. This is one of the most notorious, just awful pathogens that we have on Earth. This is what HIV looks like under an electron microscope. You can see this very strangely shaped central cavity inside the virus. That's what you're looking at here. HIV contains not only genetic material, but also preformed enzymes, including that important enzyme called reverse transcriptase.